Okay, so this is the next tutorial in this series on film score, and we're going to go through the process that some of you have been asking about, that is putting together a Qtractor session with all of the connections necessary for Linux Sampler. Hopefully we don't get any crashes on this. It will make recording very difficult as I'm recording through a couple of different channels here to get the best sound that I can from the Qtractor audio, as well as to record my voice. So we'll see what we get and hope for the best here. I already have a Qtractor session open, but there's nothing in it. So we're going to try to build on this from scratch. So if you remember, we've exported our Midi data from our notation composition, from our notation session. So if we go to Edit, Track, Import Tracks, Midi, and then we want to select our Midi file, which is this one here, ruins.mid, and we hit open. You can see that it will import all of the tracks from that Midi file. Now you'll notice up here there's one track which has these little notes entered in. These are the hits from my notation session. I don't need this track, so I'm just going to delete it to keep everything clean. So I'll remove that one. Now the nice thing about this is that if we play back through, you'll note that all of the tempo changes, all the meter changes, there aren't any meter changes in this particular piece, but all of the tempo mapped changes are already imported in. So from the very start, we have everything exactly as we had it in the notation session. If we want, we can also sync our video to this, so we can get a ongoing picture of what we're doing. So we'll very quickly navigate to our video. Open this up. And it is scalable. We can also set our display to sit on top. And at this point, if we play back, there won't be any sound because we haven't assigned any instruments, but we should have perfect sync here with our picture. Okay, so now let's deal with the Midi. A couple things here to be aware of. You can customize your tracks in Qtractor for organization's sake. If you want. I'm not going to mess around with that right now, but just to show you, if you double click on the track, you can go in and change the coloring. So I like to color instrument groups together, and that's going to be useful as we go through this here in a moment and we duplicate some of our tracks to get articulations. You'll also notice here that the way we exported the Midi, the tracks all have the same name. So they're all called ruins, but what we need to do is we need to go back to our score and relate each track by channel from top to bottom in score order. So the way this was is that the top was the violins, first violin, so we'll put one violin. And we'll hit OK. We're actually going to change some other parameters in there too, but we just want to get these labeled correctly. Second violin, and again you could change your colors and things like that at this point. Viola, cello, bass. Now I'm not going to set up an entire session here, that would take some time. This was toy piano. We're just going to work with one of these tracks, and I'll demonstrate to you the basics of sequencing using Linux Sampler and using multiple tracks for articulation. So now we have everything labeled properly. Let's deal just with one of these tracks, and let's say we take the cello track. We'll take this one here. And what I want to do is I want to actually duplicate this track. So I'm going to duplicate it. I want to have a track for the regular cello sound. I want to have one for an arco articulation, so a more of a staccato sort of sound. And then I want to duplicate it one more time and this is for a solo sound. Now, depending on how complex you want to have your articulations, you may make more or less than that. You may only need to have one track for one slow string articulation that you need all the way through. You may want to have 5 or 6 of these if you have quite a bit of change throughout the score in the articulations. But for us, we're just going to use 3 tracks like this. I'm going to minimize these others, but I'll keep our cello tracks open, and let me label these again just so that they're clear. We're going to leave that one alone. On this one, we're going to label it cello attack ATT, and we'll name this one cello solo for a solo layer. And then what we want to do is we can probably start to map our sounds before we change any MIDI data. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have MIDI buses that are coming out of Qtractor that will take care of groupings of instruments. Now a MIDI bus can have up to 16 channels, so we don't have a very big score here. We really could put everything on one bus if we wanted to, probably. Let me think about the math here. We'd have 3 here, 6, 9. We'd be cutting it close, so we would need to have at least 2 buses. Probably the best thing to do is have a separate bus for each instrument. So the violin 1, first violins would have one MIDI bus, the second violins would have their own MIDI bus. Same for viola. The cello would have their own, and then the basses would have their own, then the toy piano would have its own MIDI bus as well. So that would be, let's see here, a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different MIDI buses. And let's do that very quickly. We'll create those. There's a few ways to get to that. If you go in here into a track and then click on the Manage Buses, it will give you this dialog. You can also get to the Manage Buses dialog from View. You click on Buses, and it will give you the same sort of dialogue here. So we want to have a MIDI bus for each one of these instrument sets. We also want to have an audio bus in for each one of them as well, so that we can return the sound back into Qtractor and do some of our mixing through those incoming buses. So I'm going to go to the first MIDI bus, and I'm actually going to rename this one first violin. And all of our channels for the violin track, all of our articulation channels are going to come through this one bus. So I'll update that one, and then I'm going to add another one for second violin, and I'll hit Create. Then I'll have one for viola, and I'll hit Create. And then one for cello. This is the one we're going to deal with in this tutorial here. Create. And then one for the basses. Hit Create. And then we'll have one for the toy piano. And we'll hit Create. So all of these buses. Now, in addition to the master, we want to have some buses, audio buses coming in for each one of these sections as well. So I'm going to make one for first violin. Now, I don't want to replace my master bus. I just want to create a new bus, because everything's going to funnel down to the master eventually. And then we'll do a second violin. Create that one. Then we'll do a viola. And we'll do one for the cello. Do one for the basses. Okay, so now we have our audio buses coming in, and actually we need one more for the toy piano. There we go. Okay, so we have MIDI buses going out. We have audio buses coming in. We have everything that we need to be able to connect to external instruments and have them play back through into Qtractor for a final mix in the master. So we'll close that out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create our Linux sampler. And the way we'll do that is we're going to open up the Fantasia front end. And this is a Java program. What we want to do in here is we need to make all of our buses at the onset before we start connecting anything and adding instruments. So what I'm going to do is we're going to create our MIDI channels. Now we'll click on this to create a MIDI channel. We want to make sure the driver is for ALSA. We're going to be using the ALSA MIDI interface, not the Jack MIDI interface in this. Now one thing we can do is we can label what this is going to be. We're going to call this first violins. Now I found that in subsequent loadings of the session, this name will disappear even though the identification number will stay the same. However, strangely enough, the name retains in Qtractor's patch bay. So if you name it the first time here as you create it, that name will be retained in the patch bay view. However, it doesn't seem to show up again on the Fantasia front end, the JSampler front end here. But anyway, we're going to create that. We're going to create another one, and we'll call this one second violins. And again, this will be ALSA. We create that. And then we'll create another one. This one will be violas. And we'll create that. The next one will be cello. And I'm actually going to stop right here. You would create a MIDI bus for each one of these tracks as you would before. For time, I'm just going to create the first four. We're only going to be dealing with the cello MIDI bus. Down here in the audio drivers, you're going to do the same thing again. Now this time we want the audio driver to use Jack because everything is playing through the Jack server, and that's how we're connecting everything. So set this to Jack. And again, we're going to label these for the audio tracks that we're going to be importing. So we'll do one for first violin. Again, you would do this for all of your buses. We'll do one for second violin. And we'll do one for viola. And we'll do one for cello, and I'm just going to stop there. Again, you would create one for every one of the tracks that you are going to be using, but we'll just do the first four in this case. Now, the way JSampler or Fantasia is set up, there are four available palettes here that you can, four available racks, I should say, channel lanes that you can add instruments to. This is useful for organization. However, the number of buses that we're using here exceed these four, so we're going to have to double up on one of these racks. And what I did in my example was I used the first channel lane for the violins and the toy piano, and then I used the second one for the viola, the third one for the cello, the fourth one for the bass. So I divided things up in that way. We're going to go to the cello one, which would be the third one, and that would be assuming that we had everything else already established here for the other instruments. And I'm going to add a sampler. So in here, I want to select, for this, I'm going to select an SF2 engine. You can do SF2, SFZ, or Giga sampler. I like to use sound fonts. I have a pretty good collection of sound fonts. And I find that working in this way where we're using multiple tracks for articulation, sound fonts work fine for that. And they're lower system resource dependent as well. We're going to make sure that everything is set for our routing. We want this to route to the MIDI port that goes with the cello, which is actually going to be not 0, not 1, not 2, but 3. So the cello is on MIDI device 3, and it's also on the audio output 3. Now there would be more if we created all of those, but that's how this is going to be mapped. We can then leave this at channel 1. We're going to make that cello instrument channel 1 here in a moment, and we can close this up. And while I'm in here, I'm just going to make another one. This is again going to be an SF2 engine. This one is going to also be channel 3 for the MIDI input, and channel 3 for the MIDI output, but we're going to use channel 2 for the actual MIDI channel, because we're going to set the attack the attack track here to channel 2 as well. So that's all set, and we'll add one more. Again, SF2 engine, and down here we want to set our correct MIDI and audio bus inports and outports, and then I'm going to set this to channel 3. So now we have all of our instruments in there. You can set these so that they're small profile if you have a big stack, and then as your cursor goes over them, they will expand out. Let's load some sounds in. So for the first one, I'm going to choose, we'll go to our strings section, one of my collections of sound fonts for strings, and I'm going to use a general sound, and I'm going to use this one right here, and we'll hit OK. And then for the attack sound, I'm going to load a string staccato for that one. So the same library, but the staccato sounds. And then down here for the solo instrument, which is what this channel is going to be, I'm going to load in the cadenza cello. So I have 3 different sounds here that will eventually be attached to these tracks over here. Now let's go back to Qtractor, and we're going to set our channels properly. I want the first cello, the cello, to be on channel 1. And we'll hit OK. I want the second one to be on channel 2. And I want the third one to be on channel 3, and we'll hit OK. Now we also want to make sure that our tracks here are not linked. So if I right click and come down to clip, you'll see that unlinked is not highlighted. If this was highlighted, I would want to click on it so that I would unlink these. Whenever you duplicate tracks, you will find that the tracks will be linked initially until you get to a certain saving point where it will save separate MIDI files for each one of these tracks. But these are not linked, so now if I edit one, I won't be affecting the others. You have to be careful of that. Let's connect some things together very quickly, and then we'll do some MIDI editing. So let's go to the patch bay. If I hit F8, I can open up the patch bay for Qtractor. And let's see what we have going on here. In the MIDI side, I can see my buses. These are my MIDI buses, the MIDI inputs, rather, I should say, going into Linux Sampler. That's what these represent. First violin, second violin, violas, and cello. Over here in Qtractor, these are my MIDI buses. So what I would do is I would assign each one of these buses to this input on Linux Sampler. And I'll hit connect for violins, and you can see I had a crash already. So what we're going to do here is try to get things back. And this is one of the things I explained on a previous tutorial, that whenever you go to connect buses, that tends to be when things fail. So let's try something very quickly. We're going to go over to our Linux sampler, and I want to save this. So I'm going to quickly export this to, I'll export to my desktop right now. And I'll just call this our test file. And what this does is it allows me, now that I've saved it, I can restart the sampler, reset it. And now if I open this up, whoops, don't want to save over it, I want to open it. Everything will load back in as it was before. And if we come over here, now we can see all of our inputs again. So let's try to connect this again. Violin to violin, let connect. Violin 2 to violin 2. So the key is to save, right, frequently. Now, one idiosyncrasy here, and I'll demonstrate this to you in a moment, is that Qtractor, let's do the audio real quick before I explain this. These here are the audio outs for the Linux sampler, and I want to bring these into the Qtractor buses. So if I open up Qtractor, I see I have violin, violin in 1 is the left channel, 2 is the right channel. So if I go to my violin 1 and go to 0 and then go to 1 and hit connect, these inputs will now come back to these buses. So violin 2, and cello, and I'm just going to stop with this one for the sake of time, but I would connect the other, the viola, and if I had the toy piano and the bass and all that. What I want to do then is I want to route my Qtractor signals to the proper place. So I'm going to open up my Qtractor lineup here, and I want all of my audio buses coming into the master. So right now I have my audio bus coming down to the system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the system, and I'm going to select all of these buses except for the master. I'm going to hit disconnect, and then I'm going to go to my incoming buses, my instrument buses, and I want to connect these to the master in. So 1 to 1, 2 to 2. And same thing. I'm just going to go to my cello one real quick because that's the one we're really worried about for this tutorial. Now, as I was saying, Qtractor does have persistence. If you save right after a crash, you will lose the persistence. So it's important that you're saving often. I'm going to close this out very quickly. Now what I want to do is, now that everything is hooked up properly and I know that it's the way I want it to be, it hasn't crashed, I'm going to save this very quickly. So I'm just going to save this quickly to the desktop. Save. Fine. Okay, so we've saved it into our session. Now, so the next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that our channels are going out through the proper MIDI buses. So if we go in here, we see that the cello is set to go through violin 1 because that's what it originally was, the master. We want this actually to go through the cello bus. So not that this matters, but we'll just make the input-output the same, and then we'll hit OK. And then we'll do the same thing over here so that we have the cello bus operating that, and the same over here. And we'll hit OK. Quickly we'll check our MIDI outputs are all still connected. We're going to save just to be safe. So now we want to make sure that everything is set to monitor properly. So if we hit F9, we go to the mixer, and we want to turn on the monitoring for the master input. And we also want to turn on the monitoring for the cello so that we have our sounds coming in flowing properly. And now we can hear sound coming through. Okay, so everything is routed. Now again, once you have everything set up, you want to save. And as long as you don't save immediately after a crash and you saved before, you should be fine to just restart everything in the event that you have a crash. That's very, very key. On the Linux sampler side, you can save immediately after a crash and then reload it. And then what you do is you go to Qtractor and just hit open recent, and then it will recycle everything and it will all connect automatically. So make sure that after you do anything major, you save in Qtractor whenever you're changing anything. Let's make our sounds sound a little bit better. So let's go to the mixer very quickly, and we'll take the cello sound, and we're going to bring our cello sounds down here on the MIDI faders. We're going to bring down the cello input a little bit and bring down the master. And we're going to add a few effects on this just so we can hear right off the bat things sounding good. Now, I have found that for mixing down, it's better to put all of your effects on your audio bus ins and not on the master. So that way, whenever you are bouncing out whatever work you've done in various tracks, you can bounce directly from the master without accidentally missing an effect. Sometimes if you're bouncing out from a channel here, an audio bus, it may cut out the effects that are on that audio bus. It will only pick up the ones that are feeding into it. So we want to keep the master output here clean and put all of our effects on our buses out here. So I'm just going to add a quick plugin. I want to do we'll do a reverb here. And this is a very simple reverb. What I want to do is this is going to be an initial reverb. I want the blend to be kind of moderate, but I want the dampening to be very high. So a little bit of kind of locational reverb that doesn't have a very long tail. So I'm going to turn up the dampening, and this is just going to sort of place the cellos or the celli where they belong in space. And we'll hit activate and close that. And then I'm going to add another reverb on top of that, and this will be, we'll use an LV2 calf reverb. We'll activate that, and we'll just leave this on large Hall. Just leave it default for right now. I could change this a little bit if I wanted to. Maybe bring up the, maybe we'll do that. We'll bring up the wet just a little bit. Pull back the dry. Good. So now when we play back, we'll have some reverb. And this sounds a lot more like things are in space. There we go. So right now, all of these tracks are identical. We don't really want that. We want them to be uniquely different. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit the MIDI data just a little bit. I'm going to go into my solo track, and we're going to do just some very simple things. I want to go to the coarse volume, and I'm going to select the default setting that was in there. I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to draw in a new one. So this was the coarse volume that was given to us from MuseScore. I'm going to set this very, very low. So I'm just going to draw in a couple of lines there so that has a very, very low volume. That's going to stay static all the way through. That's all I'm going to do in the solo. It's going to be very, very faint performance here on this solo cello. Then I'm going to go to my main track up here. Jump in. And again, I'm going to select my coarse volume. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Edit off. We'll select our coarse volume and delete it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of paint on here what I want the cello section to do as they're playing these long sustained notes. So I really want to get kind of a swelling motion for each one of these attacks. Now think of it like this. Your coarse volume should be kind of near the top, up here around 96 to 112 all the time, so that the velocity, the note velocity really is controlling dynamics. You can see that the velocity is already in there from the notation output from MuseScore. And we're going to edit some of this as well. But we want the velocity really to mostly control the dynamics. We're using the coarse volume to nuance the dynamics. So I want my coarse volume to mostly be hanging around 96 unless I want to bring down the sustained sounds and bring up my accented staccato sounds from my articulation channel here. So what I want to do is create kind of a swelling effect. So we'll set this here to draw. And I'm going to start out here before the note begins, and I'm just going to paint in kind of this swelling motion. And I'll paint over here until I get to near the end of the note, and I'll drop it off, and then I'll put another swell up like this. Now, you can paint like this, or you could, if you wanted to record these things in, you could do an extra recording layer and record them in using a controller, a MIDI controller. I find that I like to paint them in. I think it gives me a little bit more control, especially if I have a proper mouse, which I do not right at this moment. Paint this down. I'll put another swell on this one. And another swell on this one. And this is how, a section really would play on long sustained notes and slow music. So put these swells in like that, and then I'm going to come down here, and then right before this next part we're going to let the note velocity take over. I'm just going to quickly paint up here a couple of bars so that I have my coarse volume set kind of at the upper level for these notes to pick up and take over. Now the rest of the music is relatively short until I get down here to this last note, and I'm going to paint this one in again, kind of like I did before. Although this is, if I recall from my score, this is a very heavy attack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here, and I'm going to paint in, and then I'm going to fade this one out like that. Okay, so this note will kind of decrease and decrescendo. The rest of them I'm going to leave the way they are. Okay, so now let's look at velocity very quickly. So we'll go to note velocity. The velocity is fine, although if you remember what I put in my notation is that there's a crescendo, decrescendo in each one of these little motifs here. So what I want to do is just edit. We're going to turn the edit off, and I'm going to just take these bars and I'm going to make them crescendo and decrescendo. And we'll do this for this one. Ba-da-da-dee-da. So the high point is this note here, and then it drops back down again. And we'll do the same thing over here. So, you know, sequencing is kind of a painstaking process where you go in and you have to go note by note and decide how you want it to be performed. And we'll make this one lower than that one. Same process again. I'm just going to do a couple more of these, and then I'll be able to demonstrate it for you. Play back. I'm sure I like this sound. I might want to pick a different sound font. So that's that. Let's come down to the attack. Now, I don't want these long sustained notes to have a heavy attack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my coarse volume. I don't need any of these notes. I just don't need them. The only time I'm going to have a heavy marcato sort of attack is over here. So I'm going to select everything up to that point and delete it. And then when I get over to this point, I'm going to paint in what I want for my coarse volume fade in for this articulation. So I'm going to start down here, and we want it to be full guns blazing by the time we get to this point. And I'm just going to leave it at that, and there's going to be a heavy attack right here on the last note. And that's it. So this will gradually come in when we get to that point, and we'll hear that articulation. So just to hear a couple of points here, let's go back to our Linux sampler very quickly and check some things. Let's edit this. Before I do anything, I want to save, just in case we lose this. Come over here, and let's change this sound. I think I can pick a different sound. Orchestral strings slow. I'm going to do that one. We're going to use the slow string, see if that makes a better articulation. So let's go back over here, and before I do that, let's save. So we'll overwrite. So we have that saved down. So now that we have everything set, let's see what it sounds like here. You you can hear that expression that we painted in. Changing that velocity makes that sound nice and clean. So let's jump to the end here very quickly, just to hear what we have with this accented pattern. And then you can hear those articulations come in the way we set them up. So this, in a nutshell, is what you're doing. Track by track, you're sequencing out various articulations, assigning when they're going to be, when they're going to occur, when they're going to be actuated, and then you allow that to play back. So that's pretty much it. You do that with your entire MIDI sequence, and you create the tracks that you want for the various articulations that you want, and of course all of this will play back in sync with with the picture that you have there. Additionally, what you can do is you can bring in your audio files as wherever you want those to happen, those augmented sounds. So let's do that very quickly. We're going to bring in some sounds that we have made. We'll go to our project file, samples, and here's our cacophony. So we'll just drag and drop that in, I think. There we go. And then we can assign this anywhere we want it to play. So this will be coming now through the master out. And let's say we want this to happen right at the very end. And we'll zoom in a bit to see where we're at. So we want this to happen right here. And we'll play back. Let's see how this sounds with our cello. And maybe we'll set our volume here on this very quickly. So here's our cacophony sound. Bring it down a little bit. So you can see how that fits in, right? And it's just a matter of matching up your audio files with your sequence. Now, one thing you want to do is you probably want to bounce out certain aspects of this, because I found that on my computer system, I can't play everything that I put into the Linux sampler all at one time. I need to kind of split these parts up. So what I would do is I would solo the tracks that I want to bounce out, such as with the cello, and then I would go back and we're going to create another track. So we will add a track. This is going to be an audio track. We're going to call this cello, and this is going to pick up from the master. I'm going to hit OK. We're going to arm it to record, and then with my cello tracks soloed and this arm to record, I will then bounce out my audio by hitting record. So if I hit play here, this will start to capture everything that I had up here. Stop there, and then I can normalize this, and I have my track bounced out. So now, whenever I want to hear the cello, I can just solo this track, and I can leave my cello tracks up here off, and I can use my bounced out audio. So let's hear what that sounds like very quickly. And this is playing back through our master out, so you can set your levels here now. So we're just reducing down to audio files that are more easily managed once we have everything worked out together. So now we have stems, all right? So if you do this for all of your various instruments, you would have a stem for each instrument track, and then you can do a final mix down with these stems plus your audio files. And you'd be using very low system resources by doing that because you're cutting the MIDI out of the equation. You've bounced it all down to audio. So that's how this connection setup works. Again, there is persistence. So once you set up your connections to your MIDI buses and your audio buses, as long as you're saving prior to a crash, you will be able to retain that persistence when you open up the project again. You just open up Qtractor. You open up your off-board instrument like the Linux sampler, and you can those connections will automatically be created. Next, we're going to look at the project file that I have done, and I just want to point out a couple of other additional details and considerations that you may want to consider, some ideas for you in your MIDI sequencing inside of Qtractor. Okay, so this is the complete project. This is everything put together, and I wanted to show you just a few things here to be mindful of. Again, I have it color coordinated, which you can do just to kind of keep things organized, to know where your different parts are at. You can see here that everything has been bounced out, and down here I'm using all these audio files to play back. And if I play this back, you should hear everything accurately playing. It's been properly mixed. We have our video here, which should be syncing properly, and if we hit play, we should be able to hear everything coming back. So everything as expected there. So we're mixing our audio sounds along with our bounced out audio from each one of the sections. A few things here on some controls we didn't discuss before. Pan. I did set up some pan here. So what I did is I panned my solo instruments all the way to one side in a section wherever I wanted them to be, just to give a little bit more of a stereo image, so that the solo instrument of a section would sound out, kind of offset from the rest of the section, give a little bit more of realism. Additionally to that, in my final mix, I set my tracks here that are bounced out into panned positions as well, to give a little bit more of a stereo image, to augment that even further. So once I have things bounced out, you can start to set up where you want things to go and set a stereo image the way you want it to be. So that's one thing. You can also set the pan from the MIDI data if you want to. If you go into a track, the pan is one of the controllers, so you can set that in here as well. So you go to controller, and then you can set your pan position, as well as a number of other things as well. So a lot of different controls in there, and that will send out to Linux Sampler. At this point, since I have everything bounced out, we don't really need to pay any attention to the Linux Sampler at all. The Linux Sampler is completely, inoperable, because we're not sending any MIDI data out. We're using only our bounced out audio down here. So that's it. Pretty much how it's all put together. One other little trick I wanted to show you, though, is in the basses. You see here I have basses, basses attack, basses solo, and then down here I have basses sub. Now what this is, if we look at this track here, this is actually an instrument plug-in track. I'm sending this to a CAF monosynth, and then also to its own reverb as well. And this monosynth is really just a sine wave that is an octave below all of the other notes. And what I did is I went into the Midi Data for that track, and I took all of the notes and I moved them down an octave. So I have this sine wave synth playing at a very, 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 very low volume. Again, if we go back to that plugin, you can see that I have my volume set back. It's very, very quiet, and in the output here, if we go back to our mixer and we find the sub, you see that it's set much, much lower than everything else. So this is a trick to make everything sound a little bit bigger and fatter, to add just a sine wave on the bass instrument and make it an octave below, set it so it's barely audible. It adds a little bit of rumble to the mix, and that's kind of a nice effect especially when you're dealing with just strings. It works really well with string orchestra. But another little trick there that you can do. I think that's pretty much it. I think we've covered it all. It is a complex setup, and it does take time. There's no quick fix to a good MIDI sequence. You have to really account for all of your articulations and map everything in a very particular way to get a very particular sound. And again, as the more advanced your music is, the more complex it is, the more articulations you have, then the more time you have to put into it to make it work. So anyway, that's everything. And hope you enjoyed this tutorial. We'll probably take one more tutorial here, one more session to look at mastering. So we will master our final output, which is bounced out down here. To export, by the way, when you have all audio, you don't have to bounce out. All you need to do is solo all of your audio tracks in Qtractor, and then you go up here to, let's see here, track, export tracks, audio, and then what you do is you select the bus that you want, the output bus you want to export from. So you'd select master, then hit OK, and what it will do is it will, in QuickTime, without playing it through, it will render that out and give you a new track. Then you can take your new track and you can do whatever you want with it, normalize it. What I do is I just note what it's called. So I name this Ruins Mix, and then I go to my session folder, and then I use that output file as my master. I make a copy of that, bring it into Audacity, do my mastering in there. So we'll talk about that in the next tutorial. In general, you want to make sure that your mix is almost perfect. You want to make sure that the mix down that you have, even if it means adding some effects in the mixer in order to get there, some EQ or anything, you want to make sure that the mix is as close to finished as you can get it. Get your level set right. Make sure that you have a pretty good decibel count here, that nothing is peaking, but you have a little bit to work with, maybe in a final mastering session, but you have a good contrast and dynamics in your output file. So make sure that you have all of that mixed properly initially, and then it means that there's a lot less that you have to do in mastering, and a lot fewer artifacts that will show up in the mastering session as well. So anyway, that's it. So good luck with this and happy mixing, and I'll see you in the final tutorial.